December 1944, and the roads east of Luxembourg were drowning in mud. Patton's Third Army, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, entire divisions compressed into a single axis of advance, had ground to a halt at a river crossing no wider than a city street. The bridge that once spanned the water was gone, reduced to shattered stone pillars and twisted steel jutting from the current like broken teeth. It wasn't a famous river. Most maps didn't bother naming it. But on this cold morning, with snow beginning to dust the pine forests and German artillery registration rounds dropping every 20 minutes, it might as well have been the Atlantic. Behind the destroyed crossing, supply columns stretched back for miles. Sherman tanks idled in farm fields, burning precious fuel just to keep engines from freezing. Infantry companies huddled in roadside ditches, waiting for orders that never came. The entire offensive, Patton's furious drive toward the Rhine, was stalled because one stone bridge no longer existed. The engineer who stood at the riverbank that morning understood this arithmetic better than most. Captain Michael Hartigan commanded a combat engineer company, 120 men whose job was to make the impossible happen on a schedule that allowed no margin for error. He'd been studying the crossing site since dawn, noting every detail with the grim focus of a man calculating his own odds. The original bridge had been expertly demolished, German engineers knew their work, and the approaches on both banks were churned into freezing slurry by weeks of military traffic. Worse, the far bank rose into wooded high ground where German positions dominated every angle of approach. He waded into the shallows, testing the riverbed. Soft. The current pulled at his boots with surprising strength. Winter runoff had swollen the water to twice its normal flow. Standard pontoon anchoring would be marginal at best. The radio call came through at 0900 hours. Battalion commander, voice flat with exhaustion, construct a tactical bridge, capacity for medium armor, operational by dawn. Hartigan acknowledged and folded the map. His men were already loading equipment, moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd done this too many times. Nobody asked if it was possible. The question was always the same: how many of us won't make it back? The Germans on the ridge weren't elite troops, but they didn't need to be. Position mattered more than pedigree, and theirs was nearly perfect. Hartigan spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance from concealed observation points, watching the tree lean through binoculars while mortars occasionally bracketed the riverbank in lazy, probing fire. The enemy force was estimated at 300 men, a composite Kampfgruppe scraped together from retreating units, reinforced with machine gun teams and at least 2 anti-tank guns. They held the high ground, dug into positions that overlooked the entire crossing site and both approach roads. Every foot of riverbank was exposed to plunging fire. When Hartigan sent a 2-man patrol forward to probe the near bank, German MG-42s opened up within seconds. The message was clear: approach this river and die. The tactical problem was straightforward and insoluble. Building a bridge required men working in the open for hours, manhandling hundreds of pounds of steel and timber into precise positions while waist-deep in freezing water. Every movement would draw fire. American infantry commanders were pushing for a direct assault on the ridge, but the numbers didn't work. Attacking uphill through dense forest against prepared positions would cost dozens of casualties and burn through most of a day. Time they didn't have. Division artillery could plaster the ridge, but ammunition was rationed tight. Hartigan would get smoke rounds, maybe some high explosive if he was lucky, but nothing close to sustained bombardment. He met with infantry company commanders in a farmhouse cellar that afternoon. The conversation was professional and bleak. Infantry could provide suppressive fire during construction, but it wouldn't stop the Germans, just make them cautious. The engineers would be building under fire. Casualties were inevitable. Hartigan outlined his plan. Night operation. Smoke screens to mask initial movement. Bridge sections pre-assembled and moved to the bank under cover of darkness. Infantry suppression timed to the moment engineers enter the water. Speed and coordination. Build faster than the Germans could react, accept losses, and keep moving. By nightfall, engineer trucks were rolling toward the staging area. Hartigan walked among his men as they worked, checking equipment loads. Nobody spoke much. They knew what the river would feel like, knew the sound incoming fire made over water, knew that some of them wouldn't see tomorrow. The cold arrived with full darkness, settling into bones and equipment with malicious persistence. 200 meters from the riverbank, Hartigan's engineer company worked in near-total silence assembling the bridge. Prefabricated pontoon sections lay scattered across frozen mud, each piece numbered and catalogued. Steel beams gleamed faintly under shielded moonlight. Timber decking was stacked in precise rows. The men moved with practiced economy, hands numbed by December air, breath misting in small clouds. Sergeant Davies supervised load distribution on transport trucks, checking weight balance with the focus of a man who understood that a shifted load could mean death. Beside him, Kowalski prepared smoke canisters, M1 smoke pots that would blanket the river in chemical fog. Near the tree line, Private Edwards sat on a pontoon section, staring at nothing. He joined the company 2 weeks ago and hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the past 2 days. His hands were blistered, his uniform caked with frozen mud, and his face held the blank expression of exhaustion pushed past meaning. The plan was simple in concept, murderous in execution. At 0200 hours, smoke would flood the river. Infantry would suppress German positions. Under that curtain, engineer teams would float bridge sections into position and anchor them against the current. The smoke would last maybe 20 minutes before wind dispersed it. The bridge had to be half complete before visibility returned. Hartigan received confirmation over the radio at 2330 hours. Battalion pushed the timeline, bridge operational by 0600, no extensions. Patton's lead armor was already en route, expecting a crossing to exist by first light. Failure meant those tanks would sit idle, targets for German artillery. One bridge. One company of engineers. The momentum of an entire army. At 0145 hours, Hartigan gave the signal. Trucks rolled forward. Infantry squads moved into position along the near bank. Engineers shouldered equipment and began the final approach toward the water. The night was absolutely silent except for the river's constant murmur. Hartigan checked his watch. 15 minutes. He thought about the bridge, about load calculations and anchor depths. He didn't think about failure. There wasn't time. The smoke generators erupted at exactly 0200 hours, belching thick white fog that rolled across the river. Within seconds, German machine guns opened fire blindly, MG-42s ripping through magazines in that distinctive tearing cloth cadence. American infantry responded immediately, rifle companies pouring sustained fire into the tree line while mortar tubes thumped methodically. Under that curtain of sound and fury, Hartigan's engineers moved. Pontoon sections were pushed into the water, teams of 4 men wrestling each unit against the current that seized them immediately. The water was shockingly cold. Men gasped, waist deep in the river, hands locked on steel while the current tried to rip everything downstream. A German flare burst overhead, magnesium bright, turning the smoke translucent. Automatic fire stitched across the water. Private Edwards screamed, hit in the shoulder, dragged backward by 2 engineers who didn't break stride. The pontoon section was locked into position. The smoke was already thinning. Wind had shifted. Hartigan waded into the water, shouting orders over the chaos. Bridge sections were being joined with brutal efficiency, engineers working through muscle memory. Bolts tightened. Cables secured. Timber decking dropped into place. The Germans understood now. Mortar fire intensified, rounds impacting along the riverbank in thunderous clusters. A direct hit destroyed an entire pontoon section, the explosion lifting men and equipment in a fountain of white spray. 2 engineers didn't surface. The rest kept working. The bridge was 2/3 complete when a German anti-tank gun scored a direct hit on a support boat. The boat disintegrated, and part of the span sagged. Hartigan made the call instantly, bypassed the damaged section using an emergency raft link. It wouldn't hold armor, but it would hold infantry. That would have to be enough. At 0520 hours, the last section locked into place. The bridge was complete, barely. A hybrid monstrosity of pontoons and timber and improvised anchoring, held together by cable and desperation. Hartigan stood in the shallows, watching his men stumble back toward the near bank. 4 were dead. 11 wounded. Behind them, the bridge waited in darkness, fragile and improbable and ready. The 1st American Infantry Squad crossed at 0545 hours, moving in single file across the bridge that swayed gently under their weight. Hartigan watched from the near bank, waiting for the structure to fail. It held. Dawn broke slowly, gray light revealing the full extent of what had been built in darkness. German observers finally saw it clearly, and the fire intensified, machine guns raking the span, mortar rounds walking closer. But American forces were already pouring across. Hartigan watched the first Sherman tank approach. The tank commander surveyed the bridge with obvious skepticism. The structure looked incapable of supporting 30 tons of steel. But the Sherman rolled forward, tracks clanking, and the entire bridge groaned audibly. Cables tightened. Pontoons sank lower. Halfway across, the tank paused. The commander traversed his turret toward the German ridge and fired. The bridge flexed but held. The tank moved forward, reaching the far bank without incident. Then another tank. Then another. Within an hour, an entire armored column was crossing. Supply trucks followed. The bottleneck was broken. On the ridge, German forces began withdrawing. The 300 defenders, recognizing the crossing was lost, disengaged in small groups. By mid-morning, the ridge was secure. Hartigan stood at the riverbank, watching vehicles stream across in an endless column. His hands shook from exhaustion. The company assembled nearby, fewer than before, waiting for orders to the next objective. Nobody celebrated. Combat engineers didn't celebrate. The bridge would stand for 3 more days before a German counterattack pushed close enough to force its demolition. By then, Patton's lead elements were 30 miles farther east. The engineer company moved to a rear assembly area 2 days later for rest and resupply. Casualty count: 4 dead, 11 wounded. Light by infantry standards. Devastating for a unit of 120 men. The bridge itself became a footnote in divisional records, notable only for the speed of its construction. After-action reports mentioned it in passing. Bridge completed under fire, operational by 0600 hours, critical to maintaining offensive momentum. No drama. No heroism. Just results. The bridge enabled the movement of 4,000 vehicles and 12,000 troops over 72 hours, a tactical victory that disappeared into the larger strategic grind. For Hartigan, the river crossing was one operation in a war that seemed to have no end. He would supervise 14 more bridge constructions before May 1945, each a variation on the same brutal formula. Combat engineers had one of the highest casualty rates in the European theater because their missions required them to work in exposed positions while the enemy concentrated fire. Their contributions rarely made headlines. Engineers built things, and buildings weren't photogenic unless they were being destroyed. Hartigan survived the war. He returned home in August 1945 and never spoke publicly about the river crossing. He kept one photograph, taken weeks later, showing the replacement bridge at the same site. The temporary span he'd built in darkness was long gone, but the operational momentum it created rippled forward through the final months of the war. Wars are won by logistics as much as courage. The bridge that saved Patton's advance was built by cold, exhausted men working through fear because the mission required it. History remembers the generals and the grand offensives. The engineers who made them possible remain largely unknown.